What do you believe? Now, at the end of the day, what do you believe? It's a bit of a controversial one. We like to ignore it, don't we? Don't talk about religion. Don't talk about politics. Let's just talk about the weather. But the reality is, what we believe informs so much of our life. And I don't know about you, but often I'm living life at such a pace that I don't stop to actually ask that question. And yet what I believe shapes the decisions I make around relationships, career, what I do with my life, the way that I raise my children. And the reason it does is because it ultimately forms our perspective. And to me, perspective is everything. Because ultimately, you can look at something one way, but until you look at it another, you might not realize actually what it is. For so many of us, our perspective is limited. Something that for many centuries people said of Christians, people of faith. But I actually think maybe the tables have turned. And actually the limited perspective is in not asking the questions of faith and not asking the questions of God, because maybe you'll discover something that you weren't actually expecting. Because perspective is really powerful, and it has two powerful fruits. You know, think about the idea of researching a car that you'd like to buy. Only when you turn up, it's totally different. Or maybe you decide to go on a date with somebody you've met online and they walk through the restaurant and you think, ooh, that is not what your profile picture said. You can end up in all kinds of situations, all because of perspective. One of the powerful examples that I think about this is when I was a youth worker. I did that for about 12 or 13 years, and I was really passionate about it. Love working with young people, love trying to help them through what can be an incredibly complex phase of life. Sometimes there were great moments of victory, but also great moments of challenge. And one of the things that I and my colleagues had to walk through it from time to time with young people is when they made decisions that had caused life-altering things to happen. So things like, you know, they'd fallen pregnant or their girlfriend had become pregnant. And often, you know, in the conversation of trying to work that through with them and what they were going to do, I would ask them, you know, why did you end up in this situation? Why did you have unprotected sex or something like that? And do you know what often the answer was? Well, everyone was doing it. They answered me with a perspective, but it wasn't actually reality. And they answered me with a perspective that had given them permission. Their perspective had said, well, if everyone is, then it's okay for me. But it also had created a pressure. If everyone is, then I need to. But some of these teenagers I was working with, 13, 14, 15, 16, less than 25% of their peers actually had lost their virginity. So they had a perspective that was completely out of whack with reality. But that perspective had given them permission and also created pressure that had ended up them in a situation that actually impacted the rest of their life. And not just impacted their life, but impacted their child's life. And honestly, some, they rose to it and it was incredible. And it was the moment of maturity in their life. But for most, it went on to be a life-defining chapter that actually cost them and others. Why? All because of a perspective. All because of what they believed. Just humor me for a moment and put your hands either side of your eyes. If you are watching this in a car, listening to this on a bicycle, leave your hands where they are. I don't want to be responsible for a car crash. Put your hands either side of your eyes. Suddenly, your perspective, keep them there, is totally changed. Why? Because you've put a barrier in the way of your vision. Just keep your hands up, keep your hands up. Just drop your left hand. Your perspective, just by removing one barrier, totally changed. Your right hand, different again. And yes, you looked as stupid as you thought you might. The thing is our perspective is created by placing barriers. And so often those barriers are things that we assume, and often we just accept at the immediate sense of legitimacy that statement may have. One of the things that I hear often is, well, I don't believe in God, and I'm not even interested in it because science disproves the existence of God. I've had that sentence said back to me in pubs and in cafes and over the dinner table when I've been trying to share my faith with friends and family and colleagues that perhaps don't share that same faith. But the reality is that this broad statement that's made, there's actually so much detail in it that may mean we have a very narrow perspective that actually could end up impacting our lives. And so there's three things that we're going to journey through around this whole statement today. There's no way that we're going to be able to condense hundreds of years worth of debate and argument into one. So we're going to zoom out and come up to a big picture level. And we're going to start to ask the right questions, not just the detailed questions. Because there are so many times in these questions and debates of whether I can believe in God, we get sucked into the detail when actually we need to zoom out first and then come back to the detail through the lens of the big pictures. You see, the reality is the first barrier that we've got to put down is I'm not sure that science ever can disprove the existence of God. Brian Cox is a very famous British scientist. He's not a man of faith. He doesn't have a particular religion that he adheres to, but he's an avid scientist. In fact, he's very popular, recently breaking the record for the most number of tickets sold to a particular science talk. He's very influential. He said that there is a naivety in saying that there's no God. The statement goes ... because he actually uses some quite colorful language just to express quite how much he feels this is reality. And if we go on to the next slide, he says that because science is not actually about asking the grand questions. In fact, it's actually asking the very simple ones. Science is not about asking the who and the why. It's about asking the when and the how. He goes on to actually say that if we were to ever answer the questions of the universe and God and existence and morality through science, it would only ever happen almost accidentally. And so here we have a scientist, by his own admission, saying science isn't actually set up to disprove God. If we go on to the next one, this is Ravi Zacharias. He's a very famous, there you go, Ravi Zacharias. And he's a very famous Christian speaker, and he practices something called apologetics, which is basically giving an intellectual, philosophical, and thought-through defense of the Christian faith. And Ravi was recently asked, he said, well, surely science is filling the gaps that we used to just fill with God, isn't it? You know, we didn't know how thunder and lightning worked, so we just said, God. Now we know how it works, we don't need God. We didn't know how an earthquake happened, it must be God. We won't need God anymore because science will fill all the gaps. Ravi, a bit like Brian Cox, said, well, no, that's not really the case because science isn't asking all the questions that must be answered in the God debate. We've got to ask the question of origin. Where do we come from? We've got to ask the question of meaning. Why am I here? We've got to reconcile the questions of morality. What is right? What is wrong? And how do we know that? And ultimately, we've got to answer the question of destiny. Where am I going? And science alone is not actually even trying to answer those subjects. Antony Flew is known as the most notorious atheist in history. He was born into a family of faith. His father was a Methodist preacher, but by 15, he decided that God did not exist. He went on for the next 65 plus years to become one of the most prolific atheistic philosophers the world has ever seen. He was a professor in Oxford and debated with C.S. Lewis. Sometimes he would win and sometimes C.S. would win. But he had three major issues. He didn't believe that God existed. He didn't believe that there could be an objective framework for morality. And he also didn't necessarily believe in the concept of free will. He went on to be like the godfather for modern atheism, to the extent that in 2003, he was a signatory on the Humanist Manifesto. There's three world beliefs you can have. Theism, the belief that there is an outside independent God, outside of time and space, a creative or powerful being. Pantheism, that if there's a God, it exists in the world. And atheism, that we are solely a naturalistic existence. And that outworks itself ultimately in humanism. So for him to be a signatory on that, he really, really, really believed it until in 2004, the year later, he turned around and said he was wrong. And in 2004, he said, my life commitment has been to go where evidence leads me. And I now must admit that there definitely is the existence of a higher deity, purpose, and God. In his book, There Is a God, he spent the last 6 to 7 years of his life passionately trying to point out that, in fact, it was on account of scientific thinking that he now could not deny God's existence. There's another agnostic philosopher called David Belinsky, who wrote a book in response to Richard Dawkins' book, God delusion called the devil's delusion. And it wasn't about faith. It was about his frustration toward the lack of real science behind certain things in scientific atheism. In fact, controversially, he said this. He said, is scientific atheism a frivolous exercise in intellectual contempt? Dead on. Now, if you, like me, need to understand what the heck that meant, I'll explain it. He basically was saying that he feels that in the movements that are trying to push this, there is just a dogged determination not to want to believe in God. And he said, that's not scientific. Science isn't trying to find the truth you want to find, it's trying to find the truth. So the reality is, science alone cannot disprove God. Let's take that barrier on our perspective down. But the second thing that science is often billed as is, well, science is about facts and religion's about faith. And I can feel better about trusting facts than I can trusting faith. But the reality is that science, like religion, requires faith. It requires faith to trust in theories that are constantly being evolved. It requires faith to trust in processes and learning that is always being improved, that sometimes even proves that what we thought 50 years ago was fact isn't actually fact. So it requires faith. It requires faith to believe in things that we can't go back to. I'm not saying that's a problem, but I'm just wanting to dispel the way that people say, well, science is fact and Christianity is faith, when actually they're both. Because here's the other thing for you as a Christian, your belief isn't just faith, it's facts as well. Jesus really did live. He really did rise again. Let's deal with that reality. And we're going to go on a journey in this series. And if you're a believer in here today, you have many reasons to believe. And I hope that your head is starting to be lifted a little bit higher today, even as I'm talking. Because what you believe isn't as irrational, isn't as ridiculous as you may have been told it is. In fact, it's actually far stronger. You see, science requires faith. So does faith in God. Let's just level the playing field. So it can't disprove God. And we're in the same realms of needing faith and facts in both. And let's zoom up to what I think is probably the biggest issue we've got to reconcile if we're going to throw God out of the picture. If we have to throw God out of the picture in order to understand the world around us, the way we are, where we're coming from, our morality, our meaning, I think we have to embrace thinking that totally cuts against everyday rational, reasonable, and logical approaches. And let me explain it like this. Imagine that you are walking down a street. It's a very familiar road, the commute to work, the way to school or college. It's where you always know. You know the surroundings, all the different people. But on this particular journey, you see something that you've never seen before. And just for the example of this, I want you to imagine you exist in a world where phones don't exist. Not just that they're the old ones, they've never existed. You see this thing on the floor, I think you'd be freaked out. It's like an alien bit of technology. Maybe you'd be waiting for a man in black to pounce on you, to take hold of it. But the inquisitive part of you would pick it up. And you'd soon start to realize this thing is incredible. It's designed, it's made to interact with the world around it. It can listen, it can speak, it can process information. Perhaps you'd start to take it apart. And as you start to take it apart, you'd start to understand the finite balance, the beauty, the purpose. If you came round to my house and I'd made that discovery of this particular unknown thing, you'd be asking me, how's it made? You'd be asking me, what does it do? But more importantly, you'd be asking me, where's it from? Because it would be irrational to think it hasn't come from anywhere. It would be illogical to think it hadn't come from anywhere. But most importantly, you would be consumed by this question, who does it come from? And so if we're going to throw God out of the picture in the way that we understand the world, we have to abandon that thinking that we employ in many areas of life. And there's three key ways that this works itself. The first is we've got to ask the question about origin and beginning. You see, we believe that if something began, it was begun by something or someone. It is irrational to think the opposite. We believe that if something has an origin and a beginning, it was begun for a purpose and on purpose. But if we're going to throw God out of the window, then we've got to somehow embrace the idea that nobody plus nothing created everything. And you're laughing because you know that in any other scenario and situation, you wouldn't accept that kind of thinking. Listen, if you are well-read, I know that is an incredibly simplistic way of thinking about it. Let's zoom out to a simplistic way, because ultimately this is what we've got to reconcile first. Imagine being in a court of law and the defense lawyer stands up and says, Your Honor, it wasn't my client. In fact, nobody did it. Nothing contributed to it. It just happened. You know, we all think about those unsolved crimes 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and not one of us is accepting of the idea that somebody didn't do it. If we're going to throw the idea of there being a bigger power, a greater creator power beyond our understanding, then we've got to somehow embrace this idea that cuts against everyday rational thinking, everyday reasonable thinking, everyday logical thinking. And if that's what you want to do, that's fine. But we've got to interrogate unbelief just as much as we interrogate faith. You see, the Bible, I believe, offers a far more rational option. Not one that I can unequivocally show you, take you back to. That's where the faith comes in. But you see in the Bible in Hebrews 11:3, it says, by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what is visible. The Bible, thousands of years before the theories of the Big Bang, understanding that our world came out of nothing. That at his command, it was spoken out of emptiness, he created. It goes on and it says, through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that light of all mankind. I'm not telling you that I can take you back to that moment, but I am asking you, what's more reasonable? What lines up with your everyday thinking, your everyday understanding? Some people would then say, well, who made God? But the brilliant bit about that is that science also proves that time and matter started at the Big Bang. So God is outside of the realms of what we'd understand. God exists outside of time. He exists outside of matter. Even the Bible says it, a message from the high and towering God who lives in eternity, outside of the realms of our understanding, whose name is holy. I live in high and holy places. I want to ask you, what's more reasonable? What's more rational? Is it a blind Christian just hoping there's something more? Or does faith in God actually reflect what we see every day as reasonable, rational, logical? We've also got to reconcile the idea of how can order come from disorder? You know, our world is fantastically ordered, but ultimately throwing God and the idea of a designer out of the picture, we throw out an option for order to come from order. And we have to embrace the reality that it was just simply time, matter, and chance. Now imagine I'm going to start a business. You come to me and you say, hey, I'm thinking of investing in your business, Dave. I say, great. And they say, tell me your plan. I'm going to make the most sophisticated, balanced, intricate, conscience-owning being that's ever created. Dave, I'm in. I've got £1 million. Where do I sign? Just tell me the plan. Do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take all the ingredients, put them in a bucket, blow them up, and wait. Now, I can't prove to you that in 400 billion years, those things won't evolve or adapt or change. But let me ask you what's more reasonable. Let me ask you what's more rational. Is it really that illogical to think that God would set you apart when there is still so much to show that we are set apart? Just think about DNA, this incredible thing called DNA. You may not know this because I didn't, but DNA actually makes up 4 key letters, A, C, T, and G. And from them becomes a code for all life. It's called a semantic language. In other words, it's a coding descriptive language, much like a computer system where you code a game or an app or something like that. To date, we find no originating source of semantic language other than intelligence. To date, there is zero evidence to show us right now. Maybe I'll be wrong tomorrow. They'll make a discovery. Maybe in 50 years, maybe in 1,000 years. If you want to lean your faith on that, fine. But right now, what's more reasonable? To think that intelligent design may have actually come from intelligent being? But here's the other one. You see what it says in the scripture says, you created me in my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. The Bible describing God coding you through DNA, prescribing who you are. But here's the other one. We've got to reconcile the question of probability. Because if I came to you and I said, here's a lottery ticket. 50 million is on the line, 50 million pounds, $50 million. And this lottery ticket, you got a 50-50 chance of winning. It's just going to cost you £1, $1. Who's going to take that ticket? No, come on, seriously, who's going to take that ticket? But those of you who aren't, you're silly. You're going to take it. Why? Because in life, you take good odds. Yeah, probably you take it at 1 in 10. Maybe you take it in 1 in 100. You'd probably still go for it at 1 in 1,000, 1 in 100,000. Maybe you'd start to debate it at 1 in a million. Because you know that at the end of the day, if something's really not that probable, why would I back it? Do you know what the probability of you is? You being you, the person you are, the way you are. It's 1 to the power of 10 times 2,685,000. You can't put enough zeros on the page. And this is before we take into account the probability of a world existing in a way that could support intelligent life. So again, I'm not saying that I'm unequivocally right, but I'm provoking you to ask the question, what's more reasonable? What's more rational? What's more logical? Christian, lift your head. You're not a fool. You're not a fool. You see, if we take God out of the equation, we have to embrace an approach that contends with our everyday reason, logic, and rational thinking. And here's the thing, I might be wrong, but with what I have in front of me, my belief in God, a higher being that supernaturally created everything around me, is far more rational to me than to throw his existence out of the window and say there's absolutely no way that he could exist. See, the Bible also says that since the creation of the world, God's invisible. The Bible is making its own issues clear. The Bible's saying, yeah, he's invisible. You know, when people say, well, can't I see God? Well, the Bible says, no, he's invisible. We can see him in Christ, but since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what was made so that people are without excuse. In other words, what it's saying is that the created world around us is like a masterpiece of art pointing us towards the artist. You know, we're not just obsessed with created things, we're obsessed with their creators. We don't just want to see the painting, we want to know about the artist. We don't just want to listen to the song, we want to hear about the musician. Science is incredible. Science, and I'm not going to be false in saying it raises some really challenging questions in how we understand the linguistic descriptions in Scripture. But it would be foolish, in my opinion, to just throw God out the window. And so next time we put the barrier up, next time you're met with the narrow perspective, you can start to open up a conversation. And you can start to open up a conversation. You can start to go through life with questions. There's no problem with that. The problem is life when we go through life with doubts. But I guess the most important question is, well, why not then? If Christianity really is that rational, that reasonable, that logical, well, why don't more people believe? That's a good question, isn't it? Surely that's proof that you're wrong. Proof that I'm wrong. But the reality is that in each and every single one of us, there is a strand of thinking that desires to have what I want, the way I want it, when I want it. Now, I love you, but there is not one person in this room, there is not one person listening, there's not one person on the face of the planet that is not true of. Sometimes we manage to resist those urges. Sometimes we give in to them dramatically. You have to look at a young child that's never been taught to disobey his parents or her parents. And yet, what do? They want what they want, when they want, the way they want it. There's this human thing. And we don't graduate from that, do we? I've met some of the worst toddlers and they're 65 years of age. I know a very, very bad toddler. His name is Dave Thomas. I see him in the mirror every day. Because there's this strand within us, and the Bible calls that sin. Now, before you switch off, sin, here we go. Think about the definition I'm talking about. Wanting things the way I want them, when I want them. But the problem with that strand is that's why it's convenient for us for God not to exist. Because if there's a designer, if there's a creator, if there's a best made way, then there's going to be a way that he prescribes for us to live. And ultimately that strand within us kicks against that, doesn't it? Parents, you ever told your child to do something and then they somehow find a way around it? Because we want what we want, the way we want it, when we want it. Just think about it like this. This is Caitlin. Caitlin owns one of the most modern smartphones on the market today. But the reality is, Caitlin, like me, doesn't really know how to use it. She's never read the instruction manual. She certainly didn't read the terms and conditions. Scroll up, agree, sign your life away. You never know what's in those things, do you? She's just going on instinct. She's never actually done any research. And most of the time it's okay, but she uses her phone in ways that it wasn't designed to be. She leaves it out in the sun, it overheats. She doesn't charge it properly. But most importantly, she downloads apps that she doesn't realize are actually corrupted. And actually they infect the phone with viruses. And so she starts to not be able to use the phone the way that she instinctively knows she should be able to. She's no expert, but she just knows something's not quite right. Sound like you and me? Anyway, what does any reasonable, rational person do with their phone? They take it back to its creator, its maker, its designer, or at least someone that knows how it's made and knows how it's created. She hands it in to the expert. He takes it and starts doing some analytics on it and soon finds out there isn't a problem with the product, there's a problem with the practice. He comes back to Caitlin and says something like,
it's not really an issue with the phone, that's okay, but it's more how you've been using it.
And she, like any other rational person, would respond much like this.
Wow, thank you so much. I didn't even think about it. I'll improve on that. Thanks, man.
High five, done and dusted. After all, she spent a lot of money on that phone. Maybe she wants to use it that way, but probably for the value of how much it cost her, she might just change a little bit. But the problem is that when it comes to God, we actually respond like this.
What do you mean I'm using my phone wrong? This is my phone. Who do you think you are to tell me that how I'm using it is wrong? I don't need to change what I'm doing. It's right.
You see, just because there's a designer, just because there's a creator, just because our world screams it, doesn't mean that we automatically get it. You see, there is something bigger than you. But there is also a streak within you that wants to deny it. It's your perspective. Giving permission for your lifestyle, making way for your preferences, potentially putting pressure on you to make decisions that you don't realize, but actually could end up costing you. Any reasonable, rational, logical person would not say that Caitlin's second response is the right one, would they? And yet with God, we accept it. I don't want to believe in God even if he exists. You see, the reality is that we all have broken phones. And if you don't get it yet, that represents your life. We've made decisions that have corrupted it. We've made decisions that have broken it. And the reality is that sometimes we're so far away from the original design, we find it hard to think that there could have been a better way when actually there was. You see, every other world religion offers you one option. Bring your phone back and receive a long list of things that you have to do in your strength and your power, and maybe you'll be okay. Christianity offers something different. Christianity says that for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him would have life and not perish. It's an exchange system. Christianity is when we bring our broken phones, we bring our broken lives, and instead of being given a list of to-dos, we get an exchange option. We get a second chance. We get a brand new beginning. The Bible talking about being a new creation. And that doesn't mean that we can carry on living the lives that we've been living before. We must change. We must come back to the designer's way, even though that might cut against everything we think we know, everything we think we feel, everything that society's telling us, everything that we want. But ultimately, if there is a designer, a maker, a creator, then his way is going to be best. You see, God has been billed as this man in the sky, wagging his finger, wanting to take from you. This scripture says the exact opposite. That God so loved you That even though you were the one that broke the life in the first place, he loved you so much that he would give the most valuable thing to him. The most valuable thing to him. In order that you could have a second chance. In order that you could become a new beginning. And here's the thing. If you're in one of our churches right now, you're sat around people who've made that exchange. And you'll know that they're not perfect, just like I am not. But you'll be able to see in their lives the trace and the shadow of where they're following the one that is. The day-by-day improvements in their depression, the day-by-day transformations in their marriage, the day-by-day transformation in their identity, the day-by-day transformation in their hope, in their joy. Why? Because they've exchanged their old life for a new one. And bit by bit by bit, getting realigned once again with their Maker. You see, it's the most profound choice. Because what we believe shapes everything of our life. But if there is a God, if he has authored the world around us, and if that God is the Christian one, which by the way, Christianity stands up so strongly against, it comes head and shoulders above everything. We're going to show you how that is over these next couple of weeks. It's incredible. Then we also have to listen to the claims that God makes. Because at the end of the day, Caitlin could have kept hold of her broken life and just about made it through. But there is more to life. But there's also more to life after death. Our heart in this series is not to try and prove that we're right. Our heart in this series is try and fight for your soul. Fight for your life. 18 years ago, I met Jesus. 18 years ago, he pierced the questions that I had so ignorantly put up around my eyes, and I met the most loving, most life-changing, most incredible person that I will ever meet. Over these 18 years, he's been transforming me step by step and moment by moment. It has not been easy, and there will be days where it is incredibly challenging in the future. There will be days of challenge, days of loss, days where it doesn't make sense. But ultimately, I walk through every one of them knowing the one that made me. Here today, you're going to have a chance to respond to him. Perhaps you're in here today and you've made that decision. God is out of the options. I ask you today, open your heart. Open your mind. Open that part of you that I prophesy right now is moving. The undeniable God bit of you. Perhaps you're on the fence, and I want to say to you, no decision is not a decision. We can't just pick from the buffet of options, because therefore we're then God. I'll have a bit of that. I'll have a bit of this. I'll have a bit of that. Perhaps you lost your way. Perhaps you lost your path. Today is a chance to come back to him again. But thank you for joining us in every location. May God bless you and move where you are right now. In Jesus' name.